If you'd like a deeper, more nuanced understanding of Chiron, refer to my last video entitled The Meaning of Chiron. In it, I tell the full story of Chiron's life. Here I give a short version. I offer the story again because the mythological tale associated with any astrological factor is integral to understanding that factor in the birth chart. Chiron was a centaur with an unfortunate beginning. He was conceived in an act of rape while both of his parents were disguised as horses. When he was born, his mother laid eyes on the half-man, half-horse creature and screamed, "Get this monster away from me." In response, Chiron rejected the half of himself that was horse. But when he dissociated from that half, he also broke from the animal part that holds the instinctual nature. And without access to his instincts, Chiron is extremely vulnerable. Chiron has a brilliant mind, a charismatic personality, and he's the greatest healer on earth. But the fact that he's cut off from his instincts causes him to sustain a secondary wound. This wound is an arrow in the thigh coated with a toxin that causes it to never heal. This wound is, at least in part, by his own design, but the pain is terrible and it goes on for 900 years. Chiron finally comes to the realization that the only way out of his pain is to physically die. But there's a problem. He's an immortal. So death by his own hand is not possible. He beseeches Jupiter, king of the gods, for physical death. As soon as he makes that request, a path opens and he's able to pass away. When Chiron dies, an enormous amount of fire and light is released, and Chiron is free of the pain that plagued him for so long. In the horoscope, Chiron stands for the place in which we sustain an early wound, an original wound. This wound is generally out of our control. It comes at our birth, through our genes, or at the very least in early childhood. Chiron in the chart indicates a secondary wound as well. The secondary wound is by some measure our own design, and it's normally a result of a rejection of our natural animal instincts, our deepest ways of knowing. The secondary wound is stubborn and excruciatingly painful. Nobody else can heal it, and nobody is spared. Chiron in the chart indicates feelings of being damaged or broken. As with every astrological factor, the sign Chiron is in suggests the way it expresses or the script it follows. Its house placement shows the part of life and corresponding area of the psyche where the wound is most dominant. But wherever it is placed, Chiron's wound disrupts our authenticity and functioning. It can only be resolved by going to the edge of healing and into a profound ego death. In order to heal Chiron's wound, we must be willing to lose everyone and everything. But when Chiron's wound is healed, life takes on a color and vibrancy The sun has access to more light and more power, and the destiny of the individual begins to become clear. Now, at the end of the Greco-Roman myth, Jupiter watches Chiron die and immediately raises him up into the heavens as a constellation. That symbolizes something important. Resolving Chiron's wound lifts the native up forever and offers an aerial view of life. From that perspective, up high in consciousness, everything that has ever happened and all wounds you've ever sustained have a purpose. You might even feel true gratitude for the pain you spent all your time resisting. One last thing. Chiron orbits between earthy Saturn and electrified Uranus. That place in the solar system gives Chiron a special capacity. Once Chiron's wound is resolved, mundane Saturnine life can be imbued by the higher vibrations of Uranus and the outer planets. That's why Chiron is known as the key. It's the key to making daily life magical. Now, let's look at how Chiron expresses itself in the third quadrant of the wheel, houses 7, 8, and 9. The seventh is dedicated to partnerships. It's the home of Libra in the natural zodiac, and thus is associated with Venus, the goddess of love. And if we look at Venus in art, we find that she's always holding something or looking into it, a mirror. Why is a mirror associated with partnerships? Because people are in a constant state of projection. We can't help but reflect other people back to them, and they can't help but reflect us. People don't even respond to who we are, but who we think we are. I always say the symbol for the seventh shouldn't be a mirror, it should be a hall of mirrors, because the wonders of the seventh don't end there. Our partner isn't the only significant other in life. Within each of us is an unconscious mind, and in that unconscious mind is a person of whom we are unaware. Discovering that unconscious inner person is actually what romantic partnerships are for. This unconscious self is really who we're getting to know in relationships. Let me just say here that even though the seventh is the house of all kinds of partnerships, the vast majority of the time, Chiron expresses itself in relationships surrounding love, romance, and commitment. So we'll stick with those. For any Chiron in the seventh, the most dramatic learning in life comes from romantic partnerships, because natives repeatedly act out the dynamics of their relationship with the opposite sex parent. When you see Chiron in the seventh house, you usually find an early environment that was filled with toxic interaction. Oftentimes there was violence or other destructive ways of relating. Growing up in that kind of environment sets the native up for relationships in which they're hurt over and over. And this is where their secondary wounds usually come from. After all they've been through, Chiron in the house of love usually ends up believing that relationships are actually dangerous and should be approached like war. The defensiveness of this native is often a major source of trouble. This placement has spent life learning how to defend itself as opposed to learning how to form relationships. When they become aware of this, something new can begin. Higher consciousness brings a partner who is on a higher wavelength. Remember, Chiron in the first has a lot of shine, but so does Chiron on the other side of the chart. It just manifests differently. It manifests as having a potent effect on other people. These natives are generally unaware of this effect, and that's because they're quite mired down in relationships that drain them. In particular, those that are based in people pleasing. There is a tendency for them to be nice as a way to cover their rage. They're also willing to lose the self for the sake of peace. Relationships really suck these natives in, and partly that's because with this placement, their relationships are full of dilemmas, never simple. The amount of focus they put on love can make them blind to a lot of other things in life. The character of Chiron in myth is charismatic. He's a brilliant healer who's also deeply wounded and very broken. The wounded and broken part seems to be the most memorable because when you ask these natives to look back on relationships, they see a series of train wrecks and emotional disasters rather than the whole picture. It's important to pick through those supposed relationship failures and find out what the lessons were and what gifts and improvements came out of those encounters. What these natives really want, deep down in their Venusian soul, is admiration. But in order to get that, they really have to understand the mirror, the I am you and you are me. I see me in you and you see what I think of myself, reality of relationships. When they master this complex dynamic, they have much more control. Those relationships also take on a much greater meaning. This is important because Chiron in the seventh has some significant strains. The seventh is the gate to other people at large, and Chiron is sensitive, especially to what others need to know. In short, These natives have their fingers on the pulse. They seem to know what the masses are doing, thinking, and wanting. So once Chiron in the seventh trades toxic relationships for higher ones, they're able to be a channel of the collective unconscious of their time. And this gift tends to weave itself into some facet of healing, which can now flow unimpeded. There are more traumatic births with this placement than I've seen with any other. Sometimes the trauma occurs during the delivery, and other times the trauma surrounds the baby, manifesting perhaps as families at war or parents at war. The physician and author Gabor Mate tells a story of being 2 months old when Hitler's army invaded Hungary. His mother was young and alone, his father in a labor camp. He was crying nonstop in his crib, so his mother called the doctor. The doctor said, "Sure, I can come look at him, but just so you know, all my Jewish babies won't stop crying." Even in the pre-verbal stage, humans soak up what's in the air, pulling in tension and turmoil from frightened and depressed caretakers. When we see Chiron in the eighth, this is doubly true. And these natives feel responsible for the anger, pain, or disappointment that swirls around them. Another commonality with Chiron in the eighth is early childhood abuse. This might include growing up in a household where perceived shortcomings were held over the native's head and accumulated over the years, causing them to compare themselves to others indefinitely. These perceived deficits become part of a poor self-concept. Chiron in the eighth then comes to believe that authenticity is not possible. If you open your heart, someone will hurt you and it will have to shut again. And that's the part that really hurts, a closed heart. But if you open it again, you'll be betrayed, disappointed, and abandoned. These early traumas and their paranoia about being hurt resurface again and again in intimate relationships. I think for Chiron in the eighth, it's suitable to call an intimate relationship a minefield. And yet this placement feels compelled to enter these relationships because for them, this is where the most personal transformation occurs. They grow through deep encounters with others and truly desire to be at one with another human being. But it isn't easy. This is the house of death, with a penchant for self-destruction. That means the unhealed native kills both peace and potential as it begins to take shape, even if it's their own effort. One of the reasons this occurs is because Chiron in the eighth has a poor ability to manage emotions, especially rage. The pain and confusion that comes from their early childhood trauma causes them to give their power away to those closest to them. One very serious drain on self-esteem is mismanagement of the emotional nature, which here tends to be rather intense and easily triggered. The other pitfalls of the eighth are sexual compulsions, struggles with money, struggles with power, and being very tempted by the ways money allows power over others. The underbelly of this Chiron is the desire to control people, what they say, how they act, even what they want. Whenever this happens, it's a sure sign that the native has stopped looking inward and has decided to control what happens outside of themselves. This placement is hypervigilant, and thus they strike out easily at both adversaries and people who are trying to love them. You see, they believe that just about everyone is trying to control them, which is sometimes a projection and sometimes a reality. Likewise, with Chiron here, there's a sensitivity to darkness. These natives tend to dwell unnecessarily on the morbid aspects of life, the worst things going on. They also linger on the darknesses within themselves, but they tend to be quite secretive about that, and thus they're reluctant to enter into any kind of psychotherapies. And let's not forget sexuality with Chiron in the eighth. I've seen everything from long-term sexual abuse to anxiety that manifests as sexual arousal to extreme promiscuity, because they're determined not to be possessed by anyone. They don't even get the person's name. You also find sticky situations here, like love triangles and messing with married people. They do that so that sex includes feelings of power and powerlessness and hopelessness combined with intense desire. This behavior goes way back to their most primal relationship, the one with their mother. These natives feel mauled by their mother. They can only heal when they examine the psychological impact their mother had on them and repair that damage. You know this Chiron is getting healthy when they apply a good value system onto sex, money, desire, and emotion. You know they're healed when their emotions are intense, flowing freely, but include unbridled joy. When Chiron is in the ninth, the awakening of the religious and spiritual instinct usually comes early, but they enter an invalidating environment. And that invalidation is often multi-generational. One of the most common situations I've heard is the experience of gaslighting as a core wound. In the early environment, there was a problem telling lies from the truth. Often, a destructive and dysfunctional life was packaged and presented to them as perfectly normal. Why would this be considered a wound rather than a simple inconvenience? Because this Chiron in particular deeply desires a solid belief system. And being gaslit means that solid belief system cannot develop. This native spends a lot of life crippled, unable to perceive their own philosophy or the world around them clearly. It disrupts the spiritual or psychological path. That means everything to this placement. Most importantly, it wounds the relationship with the higher self. I've sometimes seen this placement come off as worldly and knowledgeable about religion and spiritual topics, but it's superficial if you dig. They're really rather attached to what's safe and known. But a wounded Chiron in the ninth really doesn't know what to believe. Rage and sadness and grief over this get bottled up, and that creates an existential crisis. You see, Chiron in the ninth feels that there's something really big and sacred within them, but they can't let it out and they can't name it or touch it. And a legitimate connection with something greater than the self is just absent. This placement has a deep devotional quality, and they don't know what to do with it or where to put it, partly because mainstream religions don't offer much to a thinking person, not one who's seriously searching and has questions that need to be answered. They may, in response, make a god out of something mundane. They often don't know they're doing this, but it happens, and it can be anything like food, a sport, education, maybe a cult movie. And they pursue the object of their devotion with an enthusiasm meant for the divine. This Chiron placement is at risk of depression always, because they're very sensitive to losing hope and losing any vision they might be holding. For Chiron in the ninth, losing vision is absolutely crushing. Sometimes they overreact and become nihilists. They decide to have faith in nothing. That's a way to cover their disappointment and despair. But that doesn't normally last. It's a temporary reaction to being spiritually wounded. An unhealed wound in this house can bring some unpleasant personality traits, like being self-righteous or argumentative or too blunt. These stem from being uncertain, being unable to stand in their own truth. Now, encounters with people should be like breathing. Inhale, exhale, some giving, some taking. A wounded Chiron in the ninth might not even understand why it's so difficult to develop or keep intimate relationships, but these traits are usually why. Argumentativeness pushes people away, it doesn't draw them closer. Chiron's core wounding is often very deeply buried in this house. And so the native doesn't understand why they're not getting the empathy they're expecting. The more grounded a person is in their own truth, the less need they have to be right, and the closer their relationships can be. Now, when it comes to healing, this Chiron does well to softening ideas and softening judgments makes for a softer and more appealing message. This is the house of expansion, dissemination, and publishing. So there's always a potential for this placement that they'll end up with a wide public reach. Chiron in the ninth has an inborn, intuitive understanding of universal laws. And an important feature of life for them is a mindful mission that includes a loving relationship with the higher self. That usually means finding a religious or secular spiritual center where they feel they belong. This is also the house of politics. So sometimes getting involved in political activism can take the place of spirituality or be the path that brings them to the divine. As with every other Chiron placement, they must be willing to give up everyone and every comfort for the sake of healing. Then a strong connection with the higher realms can be achieved, and messages of love and truth can begin flowing from that higher self. Some people feel a special resonance with Chiron. If Chiron calls you, it's important to come in for a chart reading in which we can bring in Chiron's sign placement along with its aspects to other planets and how it is functioning when it comes to the sun. Thank you for watching Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. Next is all the ways you can get in touch for a birth chart reading and full astrological services.